It started like any other summer night in Roswell, New Mexico. The sky stretched endlessly, painted in shades of indigo and deep violet, dotted with stars so clear you felt you could reach up and touch them. The kind of stars that whispered of other worlds quietly, from far away. The desert was still. Still in that eerie, perfect way, like time had paused. The air hung thick with heat from the day, but the wind had cooled, gliding low across the sand, carrying the scent of mesquite and dust. Crickets chirped in rhythmic pulses. A coyote howled in the distance briefly. Then silence returned, deeper than before. The lights in town flickered behind curtains and screen doors as families settled in, unaware that the night sky above them had begun to change. First, a hum. Low. Subtle. Almost too low to hear. Then, a flicker. A streak of silver like lightning without thunder sliced across the horizon. It moved too fast. Too smooth. Then it stopped. Midair. And in that instant, the silence cracked open. A flash. A tremor. A burst of something that made birds scatter from trees miles away. The sand shivered. And above the desert floor, something descended slow, deliberate, like it had done this before. It didn't fall. It landed. That night was supposed to be like any other. But what happened next would change the way we looked at the stars forever. By the early 1950s, I had stopped recognizing myself. Not in the mirror. Not in photos. Not even in my own memories. I had become a man made of secrets. Someone whose entire existence was structured around what couldn't be said. What shouldn't be remembered. And what must never be believed. I lost friends. Not in battle but in silence. Some disappeared without a word. Others changed. Grew quiet. Paranoid. Like they knew they were being watched, but couldn't prove it. And then, one by one, they were gone. Transferred. Retired. Deceased. There was Corporal Jensen, the MP, who stood beside me at the crash site. He wrote a letter to his sister weeks later, saying, "What we saw wasn't from this earth. And they don't want it known." 3 days after he mailed that letter, his car went off a cliff in broad daylight. The brakes, they said, had failed. But there were no skid marks. And the road was dry. I attended his funeral in silence, standing among men in suits who didn't speak and didn't grieve. Then there was Major Marcel. The man who said the words that would haunt me forever, "This isn't from this world." He was reassigned to a weather monitoring unit. They stripped him of clearance. Told him to keep his head down. He did until 1978, when a reporter tracked him down. He spoke up. Told his side. 2 months later, he suffered a mild heart attack. He lived, but never spoke about Roswell again. And then there were the families. Wives who asked questions they weren't supposed to. Children who heard too much through closed doors. Homes broken apart by silence and suspicion. I never married. How could I? I couldn't promise honesty. I couldn't offer a name to the things I'd seen. I couldn't give someone the life I no longer understood myself. So I drifted. From base to base. From assignment to assignment. Watching. listening, never fully sleeping. Because the truth is this: knowing is dangerous, but remembering is fatal. There are entire cemeteries filled with men who knew too much. And the few of us left, we carry their ghosts. It's been over 50 years since Roswell. The world has changed in ways I never could have imagined back then. Satellites in orbit, computers in our pockets, probes sent to other planets. But somehow, we still pretend we're alone. And I still remember everything. The military gave me medals, retirement benefits, a quiet house in a quiet town with neighbors who never asked too many questions. On paper, I'm just another forgotten veteran. But at night, when the world goes quiet and the desert wind comes whispering through the windows, I go back to that stretch of pasture, back to that impossible medal, back to the empty, black eyes staring up at me from the sand. I've tried to forget. God knows I've tried. But memory is a living thing. You can bury it, but it claws its way up. Sometimes I wake in a sweat, convinced I hear the hum again, that low vibration that wasn't sound so much as feeling. It presses into your bones, into your blood. Other nights, I sit outside and stare up at the stars. I wonder if they are still watching, if they ever left, or if they are just waiting for us to grow up, to be ready. But readiness doesn't come from silence. It comes from truth. Last year, I received a letter, typed, no return address. It read, "You held the line longer than most. But people are starting to listen now. It's time." Inside was a photo, grainy, black and white, of that same curved panel from Roswell. The same symbols, the same shimmer. I don't know who sent it, but I knew what it meant. My silence was no longer keeping them safe. It was keeping them in power. So here I am, old, alone, talking to a tape recorder. Not because I want attention, but because someone, somewhere, needs to remember what really happened. The stars didn't betray us. We betrayed ourselves. They say the universe is too vast for us to be alone. But I no longer wonder if we're alone. I wonder if we were ever meant to know we're not. Roswell wasn't a beginning. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't even a crash. It was a reveal. A single moment when the veil lifted, and something else, someone else peeked through. Not to say hello, but to see if we were ready. We weren't. So we lied. We covered. We silenced. And in doing so, we proved one terrible truth. We fear the unknown more than we value the truth. We buried evidence under concrete, locked secrets in vaults, labeled the witnesses as drunks, fools, or worse, traitors. But the thing about truth is, it doesn't rot. It waits. And I believe it's waiting still. Somewhere in a forgotten hangar, behind classified walls, that wreckage still rests. Silent. Watching. Waiting for the day when silence finally cracks. So if you're listening to this, not just hearing it, but really listening, then do one thing for me. Look up. Not with fear, but with wonder. Because the stars are not just light years away. They are much closer than you think. And one day, when the time is right, they might look back. And when they do, you'll want to remember that it started here. In the desert. In the silence. On a summer night. When something fell from the sky and changed everything. My name is Thomas Whitaker. In 1947, I was just 23, a fresh recruit in the United States Air Force, stationed at Roswell Army Airfield. Young, green, full of duty, and dangerously curious. I was the kind of man who asked questions before thinking of the consequences. I worked in communications. Night shifts. Alone, most of the time. Staring at blinking lights and listening to the low hum of static. It was boring. But that night, July 2nd, it felt different. A thunderstorm had just rolled through. The sky still flickered with distant flashes, soft rumbles trailing behind them like echoes too tired to reach us. The air was thick and charged, like it hadn't decided whether to settle down or start again. It smelled of ozone and scorched earth like the air itself had been burned. I was sitting in the comms room, sipping cold coffee and sorting cipher logs when the static changed. It wasn't the usual pops and clicks. It was sharper, purposeful. Then the voice broke through, thin and crackling. Object down. Something fell, northwest of Corona. Metallic. No fire. No sound. It just dropped. I leaned in, adjusted the frequency. Then came more details. A local rancher, William Mac Brazel, had seen the wreckage while checking on his sheep. Said it looked like a silver disc, torn into pieces across his field. The metal shimmered strangely, he said. Lighter than it should be. Not burned. Just wrong. We chuckled. A flying saucer? Sounded like nonsense. Something you'd find in a pulp magazine next to ray guns and green Martians. But before I could share the laugh with anyone, the door creaked open. A man in an officer's uniform stepped inside. No smile. No small talk. Orders from command. You're going with Major Marcel. First light. Bring a field kit. Just like that, everything shifted. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment my life left a known world behind. Something had come down in the desert at night. And by dawn, we were on our way to meet it. We left the base before sunrise. Major Jesse Marcel drove ahead in a military jeep, while I followed in a covered truck with 2 MPs in the back. None of us spoke much. The only sounds were the rumble of the tires over the dirt road and the wind whispering across the open plains. Every so often, I'd catch Marcel glancing at the horizon, like he expected something to rise out of it. The desert in early morning has a strange beauty, quiet, golden, untouched. But that morning, it felt off. The air had a weight to it. Not heat. Not dust. Something heavier. Like the land itself was holding its breath. When we arrived at the ranch, the owner, Mac Brazel, was already waiting. A tall, weathered man with tired eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't speak much either. Just pointed toward a fenced-off pasture and said, "It's still there. Just like I found it." We walked in, and I'll never forget what I saw. The ground was littered with metallic debris, thin, almost like foil, but stronger than steel. It shimmered in the morning sun, shifting colors like oil on water. I bent down to pick up a piece. It was cold, unnaturally cold, and when I tried to bend it, it snapped back into shape like it had memory. Marcel knelt beside a larger section, part of a curved structure, partially buried in the soil. No seams, no rivets, no burn marks. Just perfect, seamless metal. Not like anything I'd seen, not German, not Japanese, and certainly not American. Then I saw them symbols etched into one of the panels. Not words, not numbers, but shapes, fluid, geometric, almost alive. As if they weren't just written, but grown into the surface. Marcel whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. This isn't from Earth. The MPs looked shaken. One crossed himself. But that wasn't the end of it. About 30 yards further, hidden behind a cluster of brush and broken fence posts, we found something else. At first I thought it was a mannequin shard, misshapen, partially covered in the same strange material. But as we moved closer, that illusion dissolved. It was small. No taller than a child. Thin limbs. Long fingers. Skin the color of ash. And the eyes, wide, black, and hollow. Not like ours. Not like anything that belongs here. The body was still. Silent. But the moment we saw it, truly saw it, the desert didn't feel empty anymore. Something had arrived. And something had died. Marcel said nothing. He just stared. Then he stood up, adjusted his hat, and said, "We need to call this in. Now." We arrived back at Roswell Army Airfield just before noon. The sun was high, but it felt colder than it should. Everything seemed quieter. Like the base itself already knew something had shifted, like it was bracing for what we had brought back. The debris was sealed in heavy crates and moved to a restricted hangar. The strange metallic pieces were handled with gloves, placed carefully into padded containers as if they were radioactive or sacred. The body, what little was left of it, was taken away by a separate truck. I never saw it again. Marcel and I were separated for debriefing. I was led into a windowless room. A plain desk. A tape recorder. A man in uniform I didn't recognize. He didn't give a name. Just pressed record and said, "Tell me everything you saw. From the beginning. Leave nothing out." I spoke for 20 minutes. Every word was written down. Then the man stood, nodded once, and left without a word. I waited. Hours passed. When I was finally dismissed, the sun was already gone. The base had changed. There were new faces, military police I didn't recognize. Black sedans parked near the command building. Men in suits, not uniforms, walking with folders clutched tightly to their chests. Something was happening. That night, I returned to my barracks to find my things packed. Orders had been issued. I was being transferred. No reason given. No goodbye. Just, report to the airstrip at 0500. I found Marcel before I left. He looked exhausted, haunted. He handed me a folded paper and said quietly, "They are going to change the story." I opened it. Inside was the front page of the Roswell Daily Record, dated July 8, 1947. ROF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. But he shook his head. By morning, it'll be something else. He was right. The next day, the story changed. A second press release was issued. No flying disc. Just a weather balloon. Photos were taken of Marcel holding a pile of tattered foil and sticks props, we both knew, swapped in for the real wreckage. Everything we saw was erased. And just like that, the truth was buried. It didn't take long. By the time I reached my new post in Alamogordo, the press had already swallowed the weather balloon story whole. The local papers ran the correction. The radio hosts apologized for the saucer hysteria. And just like that, the biggest discovery in human history was reduced to a misunderstanding of rubber, sticks, and silvered foil. But I knew better. So did Marcel. And so did the men who came looking for me. It started subtly. A black car parked across from the barracks for 3 days straight. A man in civilian clothes asking around, never identifying himself, just interested in personnel records. Then the warnings. A note slipped under my door. "You didn't see anything. Forget it." Then a phone call in the middle of the night. A calm, flat voice. No name. No threat, just certainty. "You understand what's at stake. Stay silent. Stay safe." It was enough. I stopped writing in my journal. I stopped talking about that night. I learned to smile when people joked about little green men. But I never forgot. Because the cover-up wasn't just about hiding debris. It was about reshaping reality. They rewrote the headlines. They rewrote our testimonies. They rewrote us. I later learned that Brazel the rancher was taken in for questioning. He came out days later, pale and quiet. Told reporters he'd found just a balloon. But those who knew him said he stopped talking about the sky altogether. Never looked up again. Others weren't so lucky. One of the MPs who had been with us at the site, Corporal Jensen, vanished 2 months later. Officially, transferred overseas. But no one ever heard from him again. The message was clear. This didn't happen. And if it didn't, you weren't there. And so, Roswell faded. Turned into myth. Mocked by comedians. Dismissed by scientists. Turned into T-shirts and B-movies. It became a story safe enough to laugh at. But beneath that layer of ridicule, was something real. Something waiting. And something watching. My transfer orders were permanent. They sent me to a remote outpost in Alamogordo, far from the headlines, far from Roswell, far from anyone who might ask the wrong questions. Officially, I was working signals intelligence. In reality, I was being buried quietly, systematically. I stopped receiving letters from home. I never got an explanation. My phone line clicked when I picked it up. I stopped trusting anyone in uniform, because sometimes, they'd ask about Roswell. Casually. Like it was just another curiosity. But their eyes never blinked. They were watching how I answered, watching if I hesitated. One night, I got a visit. Two men in dark suits. Not military. Not local. No names. No ranks. They showed me my file. Pages of my life. My movements. My private letters. They knew things I hadn't told anyone. Then one of them leaned forward and said something I'll never forget. "You're not the first, Mr. Whitaker. And you won't be the last. But you will be quiet. Do we understand each other?" I nodded. And just like that, they vanished into the night. No record, no vehicle, no sign they were ever there. It was then I understood, this wasn't about me anymore. It was about something bigger, an invisible system that existed alongside the military I thought I served. A parallel structure. Darker. Deeper. Colder. In the months that followed, I began to notice patterns, orders that didn't go through official channels, operations that were off-book, names whispered in the hallways only once. And then, one name that came up more than any other. Project Sundial. I didn't know what it meant then. But it would come to define everything that followed. Because Roswell wasn't an isolated incident. It was an entry point. A test. A threshold we weren't ready to cross. But we crossed it anyway. It was late fall, 1949, when the orders came. No explanation. No destination listed. Just coordinates, a date, and a time. I boarded a non-marked transport plane with 5 other men, none of whom introduced themselves. We didn't ask questions. We'd been trained not to. The plane landed in the Nevada desert. Far from any base. Far from any town. We were met by men with clipboards and no names. Escorted in silence to a facility built into the rock deep underground. Multiple levels. Concrete walls. Fluorescent lights that never flickered. They called it Site Echo. That was where I was introduced to Project Sundial. At first, they gave us only fragments. Cases from around the world, strange wrecks, signals from deep space, reports of crafts interfering with nuclear testing grounds. All compartmentalized. Sanitized. But the deeper I was brought in, the more I saw how connected it all was. There were other crashes. Not just Roswell. Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. A site outside Mage, Brazil. Pieces of strange alloys stored in vacuum chambers. Biological samples preserved in cryotanks. Some of it was still alive. And there were others like me. I met Major Marcel again, but he was different, older, hardened. He barely spoke, except to say, Roswell was just a crack in the dam. We're sitting on a flood. I also met a civilian linguist working on the symbols we found etched into the metal. He said they weren't just markings, they were instructions. A kind of embedded code that changed when observed under different frequencies. But the strangest thing I saw was a craft intact. Sitting in Hangar C. It was smooth. Seamless. No cockpit. No engines. It looked grown, not built. When someone approached it, it would hum softly, like it was breathing. They called it the chamber. And then I learned the truth, it hadn't crashed. It had landed. Deliberately. I asked a man once, one of the original scientists, why they called the program Sundial. He smiled, just barely, and said, "Because time doesn't work the same way when you're dealing with them." From that day forward, I was no longer a soldier. I was an observer in a war no one admitted was happening, a quiet, cold war, not with the Soviets, but with something else. Something watching, waiting. And as I walked deeper into those concrete halls, I began to understand the most terrifying truth of all. Roswell wasn't an accident. It was an invitation. It started slowly, like pieces of a puzzle slipping into place, but the picture they formed wasn't comforting. It was cold, calculated. Inside Project Sundial, I had access to fragments of reports from around the world, incidents dismissed publicly as hoaxes or hallucinations, but filed under Level 5 anomalous events in our system. A patrol unit in northern Alaska, who claimed a glowing sphere hovered over their outpost for hours, electronics dead, time distorted. An RAF pilot who chased a metallic orb across Scottish airspace, only for it to vanish at a right angle impossible by any known physics. A rural family in Argentina found crop fields crystallized, not burned. The grass hadn't been cut, it had been molecularly rearranged. And at the center, a perfect black circle, smooth as glass. They weren't isolated events. They followed a pattern. Every incident occurred near military installations, near sources of uranium, near nuclear sites. We had always assumed they were watching us from afar. But maybe they were drawn to the fire. Maybe they were warning us. The real turning point came in 1952. A classified file labeled Nightfall Transmission landed on my desk. It was a signal received by a deep space radar array in West Virginia. A repeating pulse. 5 seconds on, 3 seconds off. When decoded into binary and run through a spectroanalysis model, it formed a symbol one I had seen before, etched into the wreckage at Roswell. That same week, Washington, D.C. reported unknown crafts hovering over the Capitol. They scrambled jets. Nothing worked. The objects simply vanished. Not away. Not upward. They just weren't there anymore. I asked one of the lead analysts, Dr. Elijah Brooks, what it meant. He had worked on the chamber for 5 years. A quiet man with sunken eyes and an office full of chalkboards. He stared at the signal on the screen and said, "They've been here longer than we have. We're not being invaded, Thomas. We're being observed. Tested." I asked, "Tested for what?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. From that moment on, I began to feel it too. A presence. Subtle. Lingering. As if something was just out of sight. Not watching me with eyes, but with consciousness. Measuring. Waiting. Studying how long it would take for us to put it all together. And now I wonder. Maybe Roswell was the first warning. Maybe we failed the test. The deeper I went, the fewer people I trusted. Because the more I learned, the more I realized it wasn't just them, the visitors, that were operating in the shadows. It was us, too. There were entire wings of the project I wasn't allowed to enter. Reports I could see but not copy. Briefings that only occurred in blind rooms, chambers with no recordings, no clocks, no memory of time. And sometimes, people disappeared. A fellow technician named Callahan once brought me a set of photos, clear shots of a disc hovering just outside a weather tower in Montana. The metadata showed the photos had been taken 2 days ago. The next morning, Callahan was gone. His locker was emptied. His name removed from every log. When I asked the commanding officer, he only said, "There was no one here by that name." That was the moment I knew this wasn't about national security anymore. It was about possession. Control. Not just of objects or evidence, but of knowledge itself. If you knew too much, you were either absorbed into the machine, or erased by it. And it wasn't just military. Corporations were involved. Aerospace companies I'd never heard of, funded through black budgets. Labs working on reverse engineering materials that couldn't be cut, melted, or even fully scanned. Scientists whose degrees didn't exist in any public record. And still, the sightings continued. The craft. The lights. The hum in the sky that made radios crackle and animals flee. But the official story never changed. It was a balloon. It was weather. It was your imagination. And we were the ones writing those scripts. I'd sit in briefing rooms and help create false narratives complete with photos, diagrams, even eyewitness quotes that never existed. We didn't call it lying. We called it containment. Because the real danger wasn't the visitors. It was what would happen to society if they believed us. But deep down, I began to feel something worse. Something darker. Because sometimes, just sometimes, we weren't alone in those underground halls. Strange power outages. Files that deleted themselves. Cameras that picked up static when no one was watching. And once, as I was leaving Hangar C, I heard something. Not a voice. A feeling. It pressed into my thoughts like fingers through wet clay. Stop digging. I never told anyone. Because even among liars and spies, some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud. And if there was a war coming, it wasn't going to be fought with guns. It was going to be fought with memories. With belief. With silence.